Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for this PENC session. For those who were not here for the past 2 days, the PENC is a traditional gathering space back in Senegal that is a space for counseling or decision making. And we wanted to take that format for the end of the days of the symposium, just to have an open space, a forum, for a broader discussion on a couple of ideas that emerged from different sessions that we had during the day. So this is the second PENC that we're doing. We did one yesterday when we had 2 panels. One that was about making collective history, and the other one was about collective practice and economy. When we were doing the PENC, we invited a moderator. For each of them, we have a moderator. So yesterday, we invited Kodwe Shun, who invited us to reflect on different points. And from those different points, we talked about memory, we talked about history, we talked about intergenerational, and also talked about relationality. So today, this morning, we had another panel that was about the deaths of the collective, a panel that was moderated by Cosmin. And in that panel, we talked about the end of the institution or its transformation through different examples. Those examples being depth of the field, an artist collective of photography from Nigeria, represented by Emeka Okereke. We had the Shomoy group that was represented by Dali Al-Mamoun. We also had the Center for Historical Reenactment that is in South Africa, represented by Kemangwa Lehurere. And we also had Green Papaya that was represented by Merv Espina. And from the discussion we had this morning, we also have a couple of points that we wanted to address during this forum. And I would like to remind that the forum is really a space for us to have an exchange with the public. So it's not only the panelists that are invited to speak here, but it's really also the public that is invited to share on those different points. Today's PENC will be moderated by John Tain. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Maria-Hélène, for inviting me to this. It's been really interesting dipping in and out of this, and I think when we first discussed the idea of the punch, which is new to me anyway, it was really thinking about this as a kind of a collective discussion. So I'm hoping that we can really contribute, interact both with each other, but also with the audience members about the discussion. I thought that I could start by maybe just kind of offering my own kind of overview of how the 3 days have gone. And one thing that I was really struck by is the format or the form of the last 3 days. And so each day beginning with a performance or a kind of an event that opens the day. So the first day we had Akaliko with the music performance. The second day with the film, whose pronunciation I'm not good. Hair de Budget. Hair B. Duje, Hair Biduje. And then this morning, the extinction surgery that was performed by the Hill Group. And so in each case, in each day, kind of thinking about the kind of the performance or the work as part of what we're thinking about, what we're talking about. And I was really struck also by the way that without necessarily saying it or without putting it that way, it seems to me that the 3 days offered also a kind of chronological kind of shift. So that, in my mind, I kind of, in my mind, it kind of summarized as the first day being about the present of the collectives or of collectives, because there was, there was a panel on histories of indigenous resistance, but then one on forms of collectives, and so kind of collectives in their present day forms, right, or now. And then the second day was, in some ways, there was a kind of a theme of history, right? So making collective history. What does it mean for groups like Chimurenga, for instance, to be writing history and making history, as you can see in the Festac book that is on display there. But then also, I think during the punch yesterday with Kodro from the Alta Lagrif, talking about, what does it mean for the writing of history from an historian's point of view, as opposed to how artists can access history or kind of make history something different than maybe what we think that it is. And then today, thinking about the death of the collective, but then also this punch is about the future of collectives. So it's kind of interesting where we're simultaneously thinking about the death of the collective, but also the future of the collective, or a future of the collective form. And it was kind of interesting to me that, some of the things that came out in this were, maybe as a counterintuitive idea, Emeka from Depth of Field saying that the collective, which we normally think about as being a gathering of people or a kind of a group of people, is not about a group of people, but it's actually about an idea. And maybe it's about the way that the idea gets embodied or occupied by a group of people. And I think that this is something that today I felt like was really evident in the conversation about the death of the collective, so that, Merv, for instance, I think, talking about Green Papaya, it really is kind of up on your shoulders, on Pee-wee's shoulders, in some ways, to be running Green Papaya. And in some ways, even though it's not your project per se, it is your project. And like, I think the kind of, what does it stand for as an organization maybe, or as a group, or as a kind of a space, it kind of is really also very much identified with you, whereas maybe some other groups, and maybe that's a difference between an institution as opposed to, a collective in some ways, is that, both are in some ways about some kind of abstract notion or concept, but that a collective is about kind of the embodiment of that idea or that concept within a specific individual. So I think Parasite, is a kind of a, something that has passed on from one group of people to another group of people in the way that, like Roland Barthes talks about the kind of the ship that kind of, you change all the pieces of wood over time, but in the end the ship still goes by the same name, right? And so that, an institution can kind of be that home to a varying cast or a changing cast of people, but a collective in some ways, even if it is about an idea, is still very much connected or identified with specific individuals, So I think that's something to think about, is like, what is the collective and what does it leave to people, to future generations or to people who come after. And I think part of this is, yes, there are memories, there are histories, there are histories, but there's also kind of like, how much is it like very much tied to a very specific moment, and how much is it, kind of something that can kind of evolve or transform. I think Merv used a kind of very striking metaphor of saying that, things that self-perpetuate are like as cancers, like a tumor, and so it's not natural for things to kind of have this kind of self-perpetuating life cycle and just go on and on and on. But life cycles take different times, right? And I mean, there's different forms of life. So I mean, there's like individual, like, there's one thing which is like a tree or a specific animal which, goes through a life cycle, but then there's also, rhizomatic networks, right, where you can have part of it that kind of like disappear and then it gets replaced. And so, and even, if we think about like our own kind of bodies, we think of ourselves as one intact thing, but really we are also a collective, right? We're a collective of all these cells that kind of live, born and die, and we are and ourselves are in some ways like this kind of collective thing that kind of regenerates, right? So it's interesting to think about that. within that. But maybe, you know, one place for the group to kind of think, you know, enter into this thinking is to maybe hear a little from you, Marilyn, about how, you know, the idea to do this project, because I think one of the things that, you know, the Dhaka Art Summit this time has been, you know, really kind of put on view is the collective form, right? And so upstairs we have all of these collectives who have participated and contributed in various ways to this. And I think, you know, what you're doing here is kind of the programmatic complement to that. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about how you conceived, you know, this kind of format, and also as a collective, right? Because it's like raw material company that's kind of producing this.
Even though raw material company is not a collective. No, just joking. But yes, I mean, I think for us, when we received the invitation from Diana, and specifically when she told us about the theme of the summit and what she wanted to really highlight in this edition of the summit, it was clear to us that our proposition would be something that also replies to what the seismic movement is. And the only program in which we could react this way was the symposium. And the symposium format itself is a collective format where we invite other practitioners to come and reflect together with us on things that matter to us and matter to the context in which we are. And usually those people are also, let's say, key persons or key institutions on the African continent. And I'm saying on the African continent because when we started the symposium back in 2012, it was really about our context, the African context. And it was really about opening up a platform in which we could gather together and share experiences and also share knowledge and also disagree on a couple of points that we think are very important to address in that format. So we started the first one looking at building art institutions, and that was also at the beginning of Raw as an art space. So when we did the first symposium, Raw was 2 years old, because it was in 2012 and the space opened in 2011. So at that time, when we opened the space of Raw, most of the things that we were thinking about were related to building these institutions. How do we do it? What do we want to achieve? What do we want it to be? And then we walked further, and in the process of working further, we were more and more looking at ways in which we interact with our public, ways in which we interact with our context, and also how we inhabit that context. And since the beginning, for us, education was key to that, and the more we were going, the more we were realizing that we would like to also address the status of education on the African continent, thinking about how the curriculums are made, how the curriculums are adapted to the realities we are into, how it's not only something that should follow a Western model or what. And then we moved further after that. For the third symposium, we decided to think more on art history in Africa and the writing of art history in Africa. And something interesting that happened between that symposium and this symposium here, for instance, is that one of the guest speakers, that was Ntone from Chimurenga, when he came at the symposium in 2018, at that time, he was already working on the Festac project, and he started to have like a couple of archives, and from those archives, he did a presentation of things that would be components of what the book is today. So that writing of history, that process of writing the history was there already, even though the book, like the final product, wasn't ready. And it's not even final, you know, it's like when you get to a point where, okay, this can be presented, but we continue. So looking back at those 3 different symposiums and the proposal of Diana, for us it was very important to think of, okay, our context first as a basis to go from, and then from our context, what it is that we would like to address that resonates with the idea of seismic movements. So we've been looking at the work of the Laboratoire Agita, which is the very first artist collective that was created in the early 70s in Senegal. And when we were we were looking closely at the idea of solidarity that was very important for them and in their practice. And one thing that for us had to be a component of it is that the Laboratoire Agita played a big role into the understanding of the non-aligned movement in Senegal, for instance. So the idea of solidarity played a big role in that, and we wanted also to highlight it somehow. That's why we came up with the title, looking at translocal parallelism. So thinking about the idea of the translocal, because so many experiences are lived and shared, but they are very similar from one context to another. When you look at the history of the context and the way in which artist collective at that time were formed. So we articulated our whole proposal around that. So our urgency and also our way of responding to what Diana invited us to were the two things that drove this idea of the symposium that we did here. Maybe Dulcie wants to add something. Yeah.
I think that there's also the fact that over the time that we've been developing this symposium, it became clearer and clearer to us that this is kind of, and maybe people of another generation will beg to differ, but this is really a moment of the collective that I think are, in a very broad sense, our capacity to live together, to work together, the way that we arrange ourselves collectively on the planet is all being shaken up currently. And we're seeing huge collective movements that this is also being brought up in the summit itself. And then in the art world as well, we're seeing the collective emerge really as a force to be reckoned with, and something that's very much shifting from the periphery to the center, to the so-called periphery and the so-called center, obviously. And we can cite the example of Rowan Grupa being invited to direct Documenta. And so I think that there was also a lot of material and a lot of experience that was building alongside the development of this symposium that was really feeding into our commitment to studying the collective. I just wanted to point something out, and I'm not good at geometry at all, but there's an inherent paradox in the title of the symposium, and I'm slightly surprised it hasn't come up until now, which is the full title is Stepping Out of Line: Art Collectives and Translocal Parallelism. And so there's a tension between this idea of stepping out of the line and also drawing lines, drawing parallels. And I mean, we knew this. And I feel like it's been touched on because something that's emerged a number of times during this symposium is the water in Bangladesh and the rivers in Bangladesh, and the way that they move in a non-linear fashion, and the way that this contributes maybe to how people relate to one another and how they relate to material. And so I feel like there's maybe something there to help us to understand how we can somehow step out of the line, but also find ways of coming together. And maybe it's what's between the lines that counts, and this thinking about in-betweenness as well also emerged very strongly during the film screening yesterday of Herbi Dujer, and the in-betweenness, the what can happen between two generations, and how that can become a generative archive, as is the subtitle of the Soing Saman Kiri Kora project. And so on that note, I just wanted to, if you'll allow me, read a poem that's in the Sewing Samankiri Kora book, which speaks to this generative in-betweenness. And Buba will correct my pronunciation, I hope. But it's called Herentinku, and it's a Soninke poem. So Soninke, it's a linguistic and ethnic group based in the Senegalese-Malian border area. It is the seed of who and of whom. Herentinku disappeared with compost. It is the seed of all the Balu. Herentinku disappeared with compost. It is the seed of all Jahunu. Herentinku disappeared with compost. It is the seed of who and of whom. Herentinku disappeared with compost. It is the seed of all indigo workshops. Herentinku disappeared with compost. It is the seed of the tasty squash. Herentinku disappeared with compost. And then this finally brings me to the visual of the lines of irrigation in Somankiri Kora. And again, I'm probably being abusive here because I don't know anything about farming, but so I'm taking a big risk. But it's a visual anyway that keeps on coming back to me of the lines of irrigation when you have the soil, you have mounds of soil, and then you have the lines of the water, right? And then mound of soil, and then a line of water. And this image that we were shown yesterday, and Buba showed some images of the fields being irrigated in Somankiri Kora. And it made me think about what's inside that mound and how you don't see it. But somehow the water doesn't just go in a straight line, it also goes across. And it permeates through these different lines, which are parallel to one another. And there's lots happening with that seed underneath that we can't see, but that at some point it becomes a full harvest. So yeah, it's just some thoughts.
You were also asking about the format of the day. So what we thought was very important is to address the idea of the collectivity or collectiveness through performance, not only through panel discussion where we would just sit and talk, and having each day starting with a performance was a way of also exposing other forms of discussing the collective, or not discussing the collective necessarily, but experiencing the collective practice, experiencing a narrative that is not written or that is not said, but that you would watch. The first day we had the performance of Akaliko, that was some type of a cymbal, and it was like a musical. So that was for us a way of starting without really needing to put words on the collectiveness of that practice. And the second day, the film that Raphael and Buba did in Somankiri Kora was also a way of setting the ground for all the conversation that would happen during the day. And today as well with the Hill Group, when we were talking about the death of the collective, the performance that we saw gave us an insight into the idea of the death, but through the practice of Joy Depp and the Hill Group, without us needing to put words on it, but also with us wanting to have this conversation together with people from this context as well. And I have to tell you that it hasn't been easy to organize that, for instance. There was always, we've had barriers of language at certain point, and of translation, not just from one language to another, but like translation for someone who is not familiar with this history, to be able to understand what it is that you would like to propose, or even if he doesn't understand or she doesn't understand, to be able to feel it. And we remember even before we came, like a week before maybe, we started working with Enayet, who had he's been very amazing, really. Thank you very much, Enayet, because without Enayet, you would have been able to do like all this. Thank you again. So we've sent Enayet to go and to go to a rehearsal with the Akaliko group because we faced a lot of issue in terms of language and exchange. And at some point we were like, okay, we have to trust the process. We trust you and we trust what you want to do. We trust what you will do. So we're not going to be asking more than that. And we sent Enayet, when he came back, he was like, yes, they should do it. We said, okay, that's going to happen. And we came here, and they did the performance. It was amazing. So that also happened in the whole process, and that also made us learn a lot when it comes to opacity of the other one that you would like to work with, right? So yeah, I think that's very important to address when we talk about what we've proposed and the whole process of it. Yeah.
And maybe that touches on something that we were just talking about before this started, which is the idea of the borders within a collective, right? And that, you know, a collective is not just kind of like of one mind, but that actually there are also these kind of, it's about the process as much of exploring the kind of the differences within the group and working through those differences and understanding that there are these differences and how to kind of, how they can be integrated and how they can be accepted, but also be part of it. I mean, I think this is one of the things that I was really struck by the panels yesterday and today is, I think, what Dulce, what you were saying is the transgenerational, right, kind of aspects. And, you know, so that today, for instance, it was relatively younger kind of groups, but also the Chamois group that, you know, was founded earlier. So there was like 80s, 90s, 2000s, you know, like later 2000s. So, you know, kind of seeing about the shift of the collective, right, as a kind of a form. And part of that was also, it was wonderful to see the archives that are available, even though, you know, I think one of the things that Dali, you had mentioned that, you know, you're working as a group with your own means and you didn't have a lot of resources, but it was great just to be able to see the photographs. Or yesterday, you know, I think Bobe, when you were showing the photos of your group, you know, kind of working on the farm, how like the photographs just really convey the kind of the life that was there, even if, you know, you didn't necessarily have so much in the way of photographs. You know, what was there really did kind of give a sense of what life there was like. And I think one of the things that is interesting about collectives is that they really are about that kind of give and take between individuals as they're working through all of these differences and dialogues. But, and how in some ways that those things aren't necessarily captured in an archive, in the sense that, you know, what we see is the invitation, we see the catalog, we see photographs, but we don't necessarily get access to the conversations that took place because, of course, that happened live, you know, in the sense that it was like, you know, people sitting in a room and maybe over dinner or, you know, just having a meeting or whatever and talking. And so one of the things that's really interesting about the collective format is that in some ways it kind of resists the archive, because, you know, it's about the kind of the moment, right, and the kind of the conversations that happen in the moment. And I mean, this is something which I think about a lot because, of course, you know, as someone who works at an archive, who's at Asia Art Archive, you know, the question of how an archive can represent or kind of document the past and history, right, is something that is constantly on my mind. And thinking about, you know, the question of how an archive represents an individual life is one thing, because, you know, in some ways, an artist's archive, for better or worse, has a certain specific format, in the sense that, you know, you can say, okay, well, an artist's archive is going to consist of correspondence, you know, all the correspondence that the artist has, maybe notes or things related to their work, writings about the work. And so there's these categories that fit into what we think of as, like an artist archive. And, most archives kind of respect that or kind of fit within those categories. But a collective is much more kind of unpredictable in the sense of, because it isn't just about like, 5 individuals, it's about the interactions between those 5 individuals. And so all of a sudden you have different kinds of material that make their way into that kind of archive or different categories. That arise, based on those interactions and those needs, so that's kind of an interesting thing. But, I think it was great to be able to see what was shown, I think, between the 3 days in terms of the archival material, because it, it does give a sense of the history, right? But I'm wondering also if one of the reasons why we're thinking about collectives isn't just because it's something that's internal to raw material company, thinking about like the condition reports and where the direction of those are going, but also if it isn't something related to kind of our history, our present history, in the sense that I don't know, I mean, like Cosmin and I are coming from Hong Kong, where I think the question of collectives and collective action is very much on the forefront of people's minds and people thinking about how to interact, how to engage in. Well, it's a difficult, but also that, right? I mean, it's like, but I think like beginning last summer and then even before with the the umbrella movement. I mean, I think all of this have been issues, and I think that something that has been kind of in parallel with artists' interests in collective actions and collective movements or collect forms. So I think. I forget if it was, I think it was Kaman who talked about social sculpture, right? The idea that artists aren't working with a medium per se, but that they're working on all of society and kind of shaping society. And in some ways, I think the interest in collective forms has to do with the understanding or realization that one single person can't necessarily affect as much change as a kind of a larger group, right? But I think part of this also goes in tandem or in parallel with social movements and the way social movements have kind of evolved. So it's not just like a political party, for instance, or kind of or a club or something like that, but also can be loose, contingent arrangements of individuals, right? And we saw this both in the the protests in Cairo in 2011, but also the Occupy movement, and I mean with the protest movement in Hong Kong and the use of different forms of technologies, right, to kind of generate collective actions that respond and behave very differently, I think, than the collectives that maybe we had been thinking about in the 60s or 70s model, where it was much more about solidarity. And we still have solidarity, but the solidarity feels like it's evolving, right? Yeah. And I don't know if, Cosmin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I had just made this. Is this working? I mean, I had just made this joke about the quarantine, but actually there is something I think quite important there, because I think that is part of a dynamic, and I think that kind of like the forces that are at play in isolating individuals and this kind of the complex of fear that is like currently created is not in a completely different narrative than the one that isolates individuals in other narratives, and to which collective action is being opposed to. And it is well known that in the case of Hong Kong, actually, like SARS and the horizon of fear that happened at the time, and the self-imposed isolation and quarantine of individuals very quickly at the end of the epidemics, and even before it actually ended, did have the paradoxic effect of bringing people together. And in many ways, the pro-democracy movement did start from that collective action that was, to a large extent, to a certain extent, also the kind of like reaction to the imposed quarantine, and to a reaction to the moment of when thinking that, you know, getting close to the other would bring upon you a specter of death, that then shifted into like, you know, we must come close to the others in order to affect the things that we need. That's just what I wanted to add.
But also the way that these the more recent collective movements do spread across borders, so that, you know, I mean, most recently, I think, you know, while everyone was watching what was going on in Hong Kong, I think then there was kind of like reports that what was going on in Hong Kong then kind of informed the protests that happened more recently in India, right? In the way that Be Water, which was kind of a slogan that Hong Kongers had adapted from Bruce Lee, then becomes a slogan that, you know,
Yes.
gets picked up in Delhi.
And specific, you know, techniques and the lasers and the, yeah.
Yeah, and so these kinds of technological kind of implementation.
I mean, I think the question is also like to what extent this is like, you know, a formal transfer and, you know, the sort of to be expected consequence of the sort of globalized world and the means of communication, and to what extent is it really further something deeper than that? I mean, to what extent is it really part of a global collective action, and to what extent are these really connected? And to what extent that sense of collectivity and connectedness can actually like bring a surplus value by not being just, you know, in isolated movements in specific contexts. I'm a little bit skeptical about that, you know. But
Hamid, do you have any thoughts you'd like to?
Yeah, I would like to add to that, because, you know, the social condition that sort of emerged in the 80s because of the fact that General Ershad, the second military ruler in Bangladesh, took power in the early 1980s. And the social condition, it is the social condition that the Shomoy group of members of the Shomoy group sort of responded to. So I would say part of their objective was to, you know, construct an emergency aesthetic response to the social condition. I've been talking to the members, not extensively though, you know, because and I've been talking to the members for the last 6 months, because I had to put together this exhibition called Nobody Told Me There'd Be Days Like This. And in that exhibition, I have all the documents. I had to, you know, sift through their personal archives. So what came out, you know, what surfaced is that they were politically inclined, as we all were when we were in the 80s. You know, like 80s was the time when the time of the resistance movements. Like you had to come up with ideas that sort of related to the political firmament of that time. And I think the first, Shomoy was not the first group we had after the independence in 1971. But it was the most important group in the sense that it impacted newbies like us. We were fresh in college in the early 1980s, and we were studying art and thinking about becoming Picassos and and all those avant-garde artists. And then Shomoy Group happened. And I remember before I even entered the art college in 1983, there was this excellent show by Shomoy Group, and one of the most important painting, I think that it was one of the most important painting in the moments of artistic history in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, I would say, because Dhali is from Chittagong. I cannot say that in Dhaka, it's in Bangladesh. So what happened is that those paintings sort of disappeared, like Shishir Bhattacharya's huge black and white bicolor painting sort of disappeared. And nobody, I mean, I have the memory, but if I talk about the painting, that's why I think, I mean, it doesn't work, because that's why you need archives. That's why you need institutions to, you know, they sort of work like the hedge against, you know, oblivion, I would say. So it was very difficult to pinpoint those moments, in a sense that you have some paintings from the early 80s, some from the mid 80s, because I was focused on, this particular show was focused on the 80s and its total, cultural firmament. So in order to bring that into surface, you needed some sort of institutions. At least Dhaka Art College should have played a role, or Chittagong Art College should have played a role in preserving some of the works by their students, but it didn't happen in Dhaka. Probably, also, why not Shilpakala Academy? Because this is the National Academy, and this is a huge venue. And there was this round gallery, I remember. I have no trace of that anymore here. It was a historic building, but it sort of disappeared because to accommodate this. And so I take issues with that. Please.
No, it's fine, yes. It's true that we will really developing archive and keeping our history. That's very important point. Exactly. Yes, maybe the education institute have a different kind of duty. They are really focusing on curriculum and pedagogy. But the national institutes, those people are dealing with the art and culture and thought, and supposed to be, should have collect some images and or not only images, history. That is really we are missing.
And I understand when you say that. I mean, archive is not good enough, because the people are there. They used to have conversation. They used to have ideas. Those ideas can still be remembered. And at least, I mean, the way you sort of draw an analogy, like the actual situation cannot be relived. It cannot be relived. What is memory? What is history? Is history. You cannot sort of bring that into the forefront. But you can talk about it, and in relation to some physical objects. But if the physical objects are not there, what happens to you is like, I find, as a curator, I found myself in between a rock and a hard place. And all the materials were drawn from, like, Dhali al-Mamun. The photographs are from Dhali al-Mamun. He preserved them. And also Wakilur Rahman, all the letters and all the other documents were there. And there were other institutions that sprang up in the 80s as part of the resistance movement. And they were like short film forum, and you have some references, some photographs and some real objects there. But the problem is, these were institutions that were, run by enthusiastic filmmakers. They were making films. They were focused on filmmaking. They didn't pay much attention to archiving. So in Bangladesh, you get into trouble with this sort of projects. And I think this is the time that, since the artists, filmmakers, and the theater activists are still alive, those who are still alive, those who were young in the 80s, and we saw their work. I had the opportunity to look at their works, and that they have emerged in the 80s, and they continue to transform over the next 2 decades. And in the millennium, like Dhali al-Mamun is a multimedia artist now, but back then he was a painter, and he had all those ideas in his head, and then it sort of unfolded gradually. So how do you sort of capture that through exhibitions? So that is a challenge here in Bangladesh.
It is delta,
Yeah. We talk about riverine Bangladesh, and everything is washed away. Everything gets washed away easily.
Space. Our destiny is unknown space,
Yeah, I don't mind that. But since you have institutions, they need to be aware of this. The lack, especially.
I mean, one must say that to a large extent, this is also like how Hong Kong sees itself. So it's also like how the cultural space of Hong Kong has been built on this, having an expiration date and, living on borrowed time and all these quotes of a space of impermanence, a space that always has a deadline in the future when, even its most fundamental, maybe not the soil, like in the case of Bangladesh, it's a very solid rock otherwise, but pretty much everything else on that rock would be under question or would be potentially appended. So, having had 1997 as one of these deadlines, and now 2047, and it's possible that there will be another date after that. So in that sense, in these circumstances, building an institution and a plea for permanence or for continuity is a form of resistance. So in the previous discussion, I did mention that yes, on one hand, there is an obvious conservative way to read the plea for institutions, but in spaces where uncertainty and impermanence and the fleetingness of memory are the conditions that define that space. Bringing an opposite situation, creating continuity, creating an anchor for memory is a form of rebelliousness ultimately. So I would say that to a large extent that would be the case in Hong Kong as well.
Well, I think that raises also an important point, which is that the kind of the meaning or the significance of our actions kind of really depends on the conditions in which, in the context in which they arise, right? I mean, I think in one context maybe wanting to create an institutional memory or kind of build this kind of permanence is something that could be seen as something that's conservative, but in another it is a kind of a form of resistance to that, or even the very fact or the act of making a collective, right? I think one of the points that came up this morning is that there are very specific rules and laws about what gatherings of individuals is permitted within specific countries, right? And so I think in places where the very form of civil society itself is not necessarily a given, like you can't just take the freedom of assembly itself as a kind of like something that you have the right to, then the collective itself can be can take a very charged form, right? And there's a precarity in the acts to that is shouldn't be forgotten, I guess. So, yeah. Okay, should we? Yeah, and I don't know if there's people who want to questions from the audience or.
Hi, thanks for this conversation. Marie-Hélène, I wanted to ask you a question. Earlier when you were talking about the idea of the collective, you were talking about how the collective is formed around an idea rather than a specific group of people. And I'm curious about how you imagine the connective tissue of collectives, in the sense that the group has to be formed through certain ideas of groupiness, meaning like the solidarity, the modalities of solidarity that link that group. And the classic sort of endpoint for the death of the collective, and I'm sorry I missed the earlier conversation about this, is when the collective fails because its members disagree. And I'm wondering if if you have any thoughts on, what kind of glue or what kinds of ways do we have of thinking about these collectives that could allow for a certain kind of flexibility, a certain kind of, continuity of the collective that doesn't necessarily have to be formulated around an idea, which could allow for dissent, or what are the mechanisms for dissent within that kind of collective?
So when we were talking about the collective formed around an idea, I mean, I didn't talk about it, but I do have thought about it. And the tissue of you're talking about the tissue of the collective. I really think that there is some kind of members of a collective are driven usually with maybe it's a common goal or common understanding of the context in which they are or the practice that they are doing. Even though it's multidisciplinary, there is usually some set of shared maybe values, if you want to call it like that. And I again will take the example of the Laboratoire Agitart, for instance, in which that collective, it wasn't just a collective of artists, for instance. We had writers, we had politicians, it was the tissue of the collective allowed for people who shared values and shared the understanding of the role of that collectiveness into shaping the community they belonged into, the society in which they were, so that whoever is attending or whoever is seeing in the same line than the others could be part of the collective. It was really open for people to come and be part of it. And also it wasn't formalized. Like, I never heard, for instance, Issa Sam say that they are a collective, for instance. Like, we have put a name on it. We have named it a collective based on our understanding of what they were doing exactly. And what was very important when we talk about the Laboratoire Agitat, for instance, was the space in which they were in. They were in this house, like that is in downtown, and there was a big courtyard, and that courtyard became the place of the Laboratoire Agitat, and became the place where whoever wanted to come and integrate could come and integrate and have the conversation and be part of the interventions they were doing. And I think that is the essential of the tissue of what their gathering was. And they really worked into allowing that to happen. And I really think that that's very important when we talk about the collective, like based on our understanding of it. How do we make space, or how do we allow that collectiveness to be able to inspire more than those who are part of it? That's very important. And I really think that that's also a point that we wanted to make when we were talking about the death of the collective. We were not talking about it not existing anymore. Like, we've chosen that as a title, but what was important for us is to think about the legacy that is left, and the possibility of a continuation based on the experience the experience taken from the existence of it in the present. And when we're talking about death as well, I think it's important to think of it as like the lack of manifestation of that collective in the present, even though like, for instance, today when we talk about, again, the laboratoire, there is a younger generation of the laboratoire today. We saw that performance that Pascal did, and Pascal works in Dhaka with a couple of other friends, let's say, who are the representation of the collective today. But they are still in the process of continuing that work and like lifting that legacy in Dhaka and also in other places. And that is possible because the tissue of the previous collective allowed that to happen. All of them, when they were younger artists, they were all hanging out in that courtyard. They were all like working under the umbrella of the artists that formed the Laboratoire Agitat back in the 70s, to the 80s, to the 90s, to the early 2000s, until most of them passed away, unfortunately. But yeah, I really think that they really worked into opening up for it to be continued with a younger generation. And I really think that that's the type of structure that I believe allow for a continuation, even if it's in another form.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is really striking is also the variety or the different kinds of collectives that we have seen in the last few days, or even upstairs, right? Like, they manifest in very different ways. Yeah, okay. Okay. They manifest in different ways, and so, you know, we have, like, yesterday there was a kind of a farming cooperative, there was an artist union, there, you know, it was like different, there was a kind of a cafe, you know, group that runs a cafe. So it kind of really and today, you know, we have, you know, with the Chamois group, which is a group of artists who are kind of gathered together to kind of create exhibitions and kind of promote their work, but then also like Green Papaya, which is less about like your own works per se than, you know, like thinking about like making a space for other artists, right? So it's like, how does that how does that manifest? And it can manifest in very different ways and have very different goals. So I think one of the things that, I guess one kind of loose way of answering the question is that people come together for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's like for very specific purposes and to achieve certain aims, but then sometimes it's also to have that experience of being together and kind of understanding what that means. I mean, I think that this is one of the things that, for me anyway, was very hard to understand when I was like researching feminist groups, for instance, in the 70s, is consciousness raising sessions and what exactly that meant to like have this format where people had to sit around in a circle and listen to each other, and they had to just kind of talk, and everyone had to talk. And so in some ways it was about imposing a certain kind of egalitarian non-hierarchy between the members, right? And making space for every person to talk, but also in that space then people could understand, or at least try to understand, like, what separates them, but then also what brings them together, right? So, I don't know, yeah.
Okay. I know this is, again, I'm just adding with her that about the idea of collectives. And you're talking about freedom also. So idea is basically any idea. When we form any idea, it's of course based on a discourse. So when we create a discourse and idea, eventually we create a boundary, or what about that? But how can we accommodate the freedom into that particular boundary? That's my questions.
You have thoughts on this?
Well, there's this concept of mutation, of course. I mean, we were talking about transformation, and I think that Shomoy Group also went through some sort of transformation, although their agenda was the same, because they were producing political art back in the 80s, and they didn't renounce that particular position, because that was an important part of what Shomoy meant. Because Shomoy is time, Shomoy translates to time. So they were addressing the here and now, and they were not worried about what was eternal, what was sublime, although they produced huge, big paintings. And there was this revival of figurative art, not the kind of figurative art we saw in the 70s in Dhaka, or in Chittagong, or in Rajshahi, the northern part of Bangladesh. And Chittagong is, the port city, is the southern part of Bangladesh. It's an important city in terms of art making, especially the collectives. There were two collectives there that emerged in the new millennium. Probably one in the late 90s, and the other one is in the new millennium. And even before Britto, there was this group called Shantron in Chittagong, as far as I recall. Yeah. So and Dhali came from Chittagong with this idea of dovetailing the high art attitude with the low art that people sort of didn't like in the academy. Like artists were teachers at the academies, both in Chittagong and Dhaka. They looked down upon rickshaw painting. They looked down upon banner painting. Now you have banner painting here in this particular space. I mean, in the mode of banner paintings, you have something here depicting history and colonial narrative. But back then it was quite impossible to bring in.
It's also you can relate with the narrative of subaltern studies even.
Yeah, exactly. And there was this work going on in the field of history, historiography, in India and throughout the world, but not in Bangladesh. But there was this third text that Dhali Bhai and Wakil Bhai, we call them Bhai, brother. So were reading back then. So they sort of absorbed all those influences, and they thought that this art should sort of negotiate all kinds of things, including maybe Georg Grosch in Germany, and a rickshaw painter in Bangladesh, because a rickshaw painter, they don't have any individual identity. It's a mode of expression. It's a popular mode of expression. Everyone, sort of dedicate to their energy and talent too. So the idea, they disbanded not because they didn't stop sharing their ideas. They didn't stop their conversation, because they are still in conversations. with one another now, at present. But what happened is that all sort of media came into the art scene, and Dhali Bhai started doing installation art. And I remember Shishir Bhattacharya saying that I don't think, for me, that's an option, because installation art, what is installation to me? So I think probably it is because of the mode of expression, not the agenda, that sort of led them astray, if I call it that, because they disbanded in the mid-1990s. That was the last exhibition they had. The fact is that the last exhibition they had was in 1995.
96.
Yeah, 96. Okay. So the idea of transmutation was already there. They sort of changed into something else. And they became individually more important than the group. So that was, I think that is my observation, that played an important role, because Wakil Bhai became Wakil Bhai as an artist, Wakil Rahman. And Dhali Al-Mamun became Dhali Al-Mamun. I mean, he had his own way of using figurative motifs, and also he turned into a multimedia artist in the 90s. I think probably he's the first artist alongside Mahbubur Rahman who introduced video art in the Bangladesh art scene, to the Bangladesh art scene. In the late 1990s, 1997 perhaps, yeah, as far as I recall, after my research. So the media sort of, and the art scene was changing, the patterns of art making changed, the patterns of association sort of changed. So that's how I think I look at it when because we grew up with them as junior students of Dhaka Art College. So that's how I look at it now, that they sort of grew out of their, thus their sphere of association, and sort of went to different places, like Wakil Bhai, Wakil Rahman traveled to Germany, settled there, got married, had children, and Dhali Al-Mamun became a teacher, and played an important role in the developing art scene in Chittagong.
My questions to you, about the freedom and idea, how you can really relate in your collectives. So to me, it's a kind of a dilemma or paradox.
I also have a response to that.
Yeah, please.
I don't have a choice. No, I really believe that the collective shouldn't prevent from the freedom of the individuals. And I strongly believe that even if we step out of the collective and we go into institution or any form of structure, I really believe that each individual should be seen in that structure, shouldn't be hidden by the structure, because the collective is made of the individuals. Actually, we can't talk about the collective when there are no individuals. So I really believe that there should be an understanding of the importance of seeing the individual and giving value to the individual within the collective.
I just wanted to tell you about a group that I was working on for about 20 years from Japan called the Goethe Art Association. And they thought a lot about this question about the relationship between the individual and the collective, especially in the context of post-war Japan, where they had just been through a war which was an unjust war, and where they felt that the collective and the people's unreflective dedication to the collective was the cause of the root cause of totalitarianism. So they thought very much about questions of the individual as being a way of rooting out this kind of attraction to totalitarianism. But at the same time, they also realized that there was a certain kind of almost decadence associated with pure individualism that they saw in certain writers like Angol, and like these people who were thinking about sexual liberation as the way forward, like in very kind of nihilistic ways. And so they actually charted a middle ground. There was an article written by one of them that theorized the idea of the Gutai group as being like a spine, that each individual in that group was like a vertebra, and that all of those pieces of the vertebra fit together in order to create a larger organism, and that was a really important tension, I think, for the group, both in terms of being able to work creatively, where they were sort of rubbing up against each other creatively and, engaged in a certain kind of productive tension, but also thinking about what it meant to be a collective and constantly reflecting back on the idea of that group.
Sounds like we have a collective going on.
Can I maybe add something into that in terms of the collective not always being a good thing, or the collective enabling bad things to happen, or a kind of amplification? So Morgan Quaintance, in an article called Cultic Cultures, talks about how in neo-capitalism and the rise of individualism, the collective has been seen as a reaction against that, and therefore a lot of the time like an inherently good thing. But if we look online with the rise of the far right and these echo chambers on stuff like 4chan, that has led to a huge amount of violence from people kind of echoing each other. He talks about the fact that this idea that collectivism is good and individualism is bad is not, it just doesn't work. He talks about how the internet amplifies this. Collectives, as you were saying, have a kind of set of values that bring people together, and all of the things that we've been talking about have been good. We've been talking about freedom of expression, resisting authoritarian governments. But I guess my kind of question is, how do we generate a collective that is true to itself and has a set of values and is a group of members, but also isn't isolationist from the other people outside the collective, and doesn't become an echo chamber and amplify?
I think I can add to that a little. There's this concept of Akrabari in Bangladesh. This is, these are Sufi spaces, basically, Sufi saints. They sort of introduce this Akra. Akra is the place where you get together. The interesting part of it is that, Hindus, Buddhists, and everyone could, come to that place and share, the wisdom that they used to sort of release from that particular space, or ideas that they shared. They were party to that. Everybody, the communities were party to that. Like if you go to Lalon's Accra, you'll find all the Muslim sects there, even Hindus there. All the sects, all the castes are there. So it is casteless, sectless, something like that. So it has little to do with individualism and the kind of identity politics that we see making trouble on the horizon, on the political and social and cultural horizon. There's no question of going into that either. So because of that particular saint, whether he's alive or not, whether he's absent, that Akrabari works like a convergence of minds. So that's an important idea that you can borrow. Like we've been affected by that in the 1990s or in the millennium. We've been thinking about it. It's in our conversations now.
I think it's a very important point to raise, and it also brings me to something else that's been on my mind for the last 3 days, which is the question of responsibility. And it became particularly poignant in the panel this morning, where I can't remember exactly who it was, maybe it was Green, but not to point, but about how a lack of formalization also allows for one to get away with certain things. I'm paraphrasing. And maybe invisible borders or depth of field, but yeah, okay. Thank you. And I do think that this is something to be cautious of, is this fine line between formalization, which seems to be something that we're using as one way to separate the collective from the institution, and how that leads us to be responsible or not as part of a collective, but also how far that responsibility extends. Because if, as an institute, if you formalize your collective action, then you're accountable as well. And this is something that I think is extremely important today. And that what's been interesting is that there have been collectives in the panels who have talked very much about the way that they work inside the collective, but also other collectives who have talked a lot about the work that they do within communities. And there's also emerged the question of whether they're from the community, working with the community, or being nearby, you know. So, yeah, I don't have an answer, but I do think that when we enter into concert with one another as human beings, be that 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 400,000 people, the question of responsibility emerges, and it sort of rocks the fundamental paradox which is at the heart of all of us, which is our need for freedom and our need for security. And the collective raises that, yeah. So I think it's, yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
First of all, thank you all for your talks. It's been really interesting to so I also really hear myself. It's like I'm in Skype. My name is Sanne. I live and work in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. It's kind of interesting what you said as like the counter part of the notion of collectivity, I think, because in Indonesia there is actually not really a distinction between collective and institution, because there is no other kind of institution. So collectives are the institutions. They are the infrastructure, basically. The infrastructure itself is self-organized. And I think that's been kind of also in the limelight in the past few years. So what we're also experiencing is actually like really lots and lots of researchers and institutions, like big institutions, coming particularly actually to Yogyakarta, also to Jakarta, to basically make exhibitions, do projects, who are super interested in self-organization, collectivity, which is, it's totally there and it's true and it's amazing in all sorts of ways. But it's also really hard in many other ways. And I think those kind of harder elements, I don't know, to do with money. The fact that everybody has a job on the sides and everybody in Jogja is always seen as this kind of place that's really relaxed and people are hanging out, but that hanging out is actually really productive and it's also a form of work. That actually a lot of our friends, what they do, they're hosting all the time, which is also a huge form of labor, let's say, that everybody's doing. Plus, I think a lot of friends are often actually more abroad than they are in Jogja, which is also a way to make money, because in the end the money comes from outside very often. And it's hard because then what is the relation with the community? It's often that there are more people in the collective, which is great, so they can support each other in many ways. But what Mas Ismail from Jatiwangi Art Factory said also yesterday, what is the value actually of us being here? And I was also thinking, of course there is many sorts of values, and one of the values is that they're getting paid. So it's also, it's an economy in itself. So I think like in Jogja also we see part of that economy that's almost gone somehow over the top, that a lot of the unpaid labor is actually being done by hosting, sometimes with maybe super infrastructures of big museums that come with all kinds of implications and all kinds of forms of debt being accumulated, both kind of social debt and monetary debt, because institutions, it's very hard to negotiate with, let's say. Yeah, just as a side note. Yeah, thank you.
I think we can see us as one of those institutions that go to Yogyakarta to investigate on collectivity and gathering and all those. No, I mean, I don't have a specific thought on it, but I totally agree because I've been there. We've been there to do that, and I agree. Yes, we're part of a network, that's true.
it's not to say like there's good guys and bad guys in a way, but like it's different if you're being hosted by a group that you already have affinity with, because then the relationship becomes mutual. No?
No, I agree. I agree. Actually, both of the time we were there, it was because of like a program that we had within our network, and it was exchange time and everything. But still, like the hosting is so naturally done, and it's so generous that at some point you're like, wow. Why did we stay for so long? Because these people haven't been sleeping. These people, you know, like you really start to be very conscious about you really being in the space for a long time. And not saying that it's bad, but it's just that you start thinking about the whole system that is in place there and how it works, and them needing to also to go and work elsewhere to earn some money, etc., etc. And yeah, I think it's something that needs to be paid attention to.
I mean, maybe this is a tangent, but I would be curious to know if this is also, and I mean, my experience anecdotally speaks to this, how this is also a kind of exploitation of places where society is considered to be more collective or community-based. Because I sure know that when I travel in Europe, for work, people don't host me in the same way as when I travel in other places. And yeah, I just wonder if maybe this is like also this kind of, there's a fetishization of the collective experience that maybe people in Europe or North America have. And look, I'm not saying everyone is thinking this way at all, but that there's a potential for a thinking that this is natural in some places, and therefore it's okay to benefit from it, when it may be more practiced. Maybe it's just something to be wary of. And I don't know if anyone else has similar experiences.
I mean, I think that speaking, you know, since you brought up Jogja, I mean, speaking to that particular context, I mean, I think one thing that I was very struck by is the way in which collectives and artist-formed organizations do take the place of infrastructure. And it was just kind of, you know, when I was there to kind of see how many groups there were and how many of them had, you know, it was kind of like, we're going to rent this house and there's going to be this little room and that'll be the residency space. And it was kind of like, you know, there was like a kind of a way of how to do it, almost like, you know, how to have a collective, and then you have the gallery up front, or the room up front can be the gallery where people can have exhibitions, and then this little room in the back will be the, you know, the space for someone to come and be in residence. And then there's, you know, an exchange between these different kind of collectives or kind of spaces, right? So you can have someone who's coming from some other part of Asia who comes and does the research. I guess I wasn't, at that point in time anyway, it didn't seem so obvious to me that there was necessarily an exploitation of that format, but in some ways it is a kind of also a kind of a maybe I would describe it as a kind of a self-contextualization. It kind of provides a way for giving a kind of a sense, or giving a sense of presentation to the outside world. So this is like how your own work, or this is within this collective, this is how you can be understood. And in that sense, like, you know, it was, there's a certain kind of initiative, I guess, in that. And it is kind of like, simultaneously like very kind of inspiring to see, but also there is a kind of element in which like there's a kind of maybe overlooking of certain boundaries that, you know, elsewhere would pertain between, like, for instance, sponsorship. So I remember talking to a group and they were like, you know, talking about how they had been sponsored by surfwear company, because the surfwear company, you know, like someone they knew like was in it and wanted to give them money. And I think, like, you know, if it was a group elsewhere, maybe they wouldn't have necessarily wanted that corporate sponsorship, but in this context they were fine with it. And it was kind of like how those boundaries are maybe navigated in different ways when it's about kind of like, okay, well, we've got this group and we have to do things and we have to bring in funding, and this is how we do it. You know, whether we do that or we work as graphic designers and, you know, bring in money that way. Yeah. Going back to the other question about, the kind of the maybe the downside of collectives, I mean, I think that one thing that struck me about the title of the panel this morning, End of Collective, is it is a rhyme, or kind of, or the death of the collective is kind of like a kind of a gesture or reference to the idea of the end of the subject, right, and the idea of the death of the autonomous subjectivity. And I think when you were mentioning, the idea, the reasons why people are interested in collectives, I think there is a kind of a wish to get away from this kind of consumerist dream world where we each live in our kind of matrix little bubble, and we just consume and we do what we do, and it's completely separated from everyone else. And so that's maybe one of the motivations for that kind of, seeking out of those kind of collective experiences. And you're right that it can feed into these kind of echo chamber situations where people then kind of end up in this other kind of reinforcement of certain kinds of subjectivity. But I'm wondering if maybe one way of thinking about or addressing your question or responding to your question might be something that Marie-Hélène pointed to, which is, the collective is not necessarily about the end of the individual, or it's not about the disappearance of the individual, which in some ways is one way we can think about fascism, right? Fascism is about the merging of the individual within the collective, right? Or a certain kind of a collective. But rather the ability to maintain individuality within a kind of a format so that there is a kind of a dialogue and the possibility for disagreement, and not this kind of superimposition of a uniform identity. So I think that may be one way of thinking about, how do we think about collectives in a way that can be socially productive,
Collective arts is really, I think, it's moving with the human being, or Homo sapien, from the very beginning. Homo sapien was really lonely. When they were looking to the animal, it is also for their own existence. Even cave painter draw the animal. It is not simply they are looking to the animal for drawing. They are looking for the meat, looking for the skin also. So I think collective art is itself is very much essential for existence of Homo sapien. And loneliness and the individualism is an aura. It is beginning with the modernism. Modernism actually keep us pushed to the compartment. But today we again reconsider the collective effort, collectivism, collective existence because of our existence, like knowledge. Parallelly, knowledge is also tools for human existence. That's my opinion, that's my understanding about collective arts.
Yeah, and so when we were talking about that just now, absolutely, this idea that modernism created these bubbles, right? But I think it's important also to think about the collectives that came out of that moment, artistic collectives like Dada, Surrealism, early forms that are in some ways, I think, as you say, a response to that fragmentation of society. Yeah, and I just thought I would just give a quote that Reiko Tomi likes a lot from Yoko Ono, and she says, "A dream you dream alone is just a dream. A dream you dream together becomes reality."
That's a slogan for collectivity if I heard one.
That's what we'll put on the t-shirts. Souvenir.
It's an amazing t-shirt.
Yeah, condition report t-shirt coming soon.
Oh my God. For our collective.
When did you say this?
I wish I had a date for you, but I'm sure if we looked at
Isn't that part of her book?
I don't know.
That
Grapefruit?
Yeah.
It might be in Grapefruit, which would be 1963 or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Seems like a good place to...
Thank you for mentioning these modernists, because actually, I think I related that in some emails that we've been very suspicious of the term collective, and now how it's become this trendy term that's been haphazardly applied to almost everything that's a collective action now, and we fear, at least where I'm coming from, that it's a kind of a colonizing term that it has a tendency to flatten out a lot of endemic action, as endemic forms of actions that are quite specific to certain times or specific locations. And I think we should be aware of the romanticism that we're projecting to the collective, as a lot of us are addressing now. And I like that you also mentioned that, oh, we are not a collective because so are we.
Right.
But there is this, I mean, talking about endemic ideas, there's this concept by Lalun Fakir. I don't know whether you've heard of him or not. He's a 19th century bard, devotional songs, those were popular back then, very, very popular. It's still popular, Lalun Fakir. He has this particular idea of shoyong, that you can become a shoyong. Shoyong is the atomized individual. I mean, the self that negates the other. So that's shoyong. So you cannot reside in shoyong. You have to come out of it. So you have to be part of the community. That's the natural process, as Dalial Mamun was talking about. I mean, that's the societal process. But you don't efface, there's no such thing as effacement of your individuality. You're there as an individual, but you're not shoyong. Shoyong is perhaps God, Allah, or somebody else, but not you.
Are there any more comments or questions, ideas, criticisms, quotes? Okay, I think maybe then we can wrap up here. So this is the death of our symposium.
The close.
But it will
end. It's the end. It's not there.
There'll be another one.